Good evening, everyone, and welcome as we let people in from the waiting room. Thank you so much for attending this evening, our Speaker Series 24, The Costs of Uncertainty, uh, the expansion proposal for Billy Bishop Toronto Centre Airport, which we'll be digging into once again tonight. So just as we get, we've got about a couple hundred people coming in the door, so we'll just get that sorted. Thank you for being here. My name's Edward Nixon. I'm one of the board members of Waterfront for All, and I will be your host and moderator this evening.
Okay.
I would ask all of you to keep yourselves muted, please. Thank you so much. The meeting is set that you're muted on your way in, but you can unmute yourselves. But I would ask you, please not to. Because ambient sounds, can be an interruption for those of us who are participating actively in the meeting and for those listening. Thanks very much in advance for your kind consideration. So yes, this is our 24th speaker series from Waterfront for All. Some of those speaker series were three of them were walks that we did in real life in the physical world. The others have all been online events like this. And again, this is our third in a row where we're tackling the challenge of the vague proposal for jet expansion at Billy Bishop Airport. And okay, well, we've got over 100 people in the room, so I'm just going to switch over to the next phase, which is our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are meeting on the land that is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewas, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and we are grateful for the care and stewardship that our First Nations have shown for this land and this territory over thousands upon thousands of years. And again, thank you. Thank you everyone who's here this evening. We're very thrilled this evening to have with us a special guest, Ken Greenberg. And Ken is an urban designer, teacher, writer, former director of urban design and architecture for the City of Toronto, a principal of Greenberg Consultants, and a member of the Order of Canada. And to our point this evening, Ken is a member of an organization that's come together to address the very issues that we're going to be talking about tonight. Here, let me just share an image of their website. It's time for a reality check. And I will share the URL for that in the chat. So, Ken, it is our pleasure to have you here with us this evening. I'm just going to spotlight you for everyone. And
20 Niagara. Yeah.
Please
there,
mute
yeah.
yourselves, everyone. Please mute yourselves. Thanks you very, very, very much. Please make sure you're muted. There we go. I'm going to.
Do we know if we're muted?
Yeah. Okay. I've just muted you. Okay. Ken, you're going to have to unmute yourself one more time because unfortunately the mute all function mutes everyone. So if you can just unmute yourself.
Okay.
There you go. Thank
Good.
you. Thanks very much, Ken. Welcome. Go ahead.
So thank you, Edward, and thank you to Waterfront Toronto for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be able to join you this evening and talk about a subject that we all care a great deal about now. So I want to start off by just explaining who we are and what is the reality check. It began really a few weeks ago, which is kind of astounding because everything is happening very fast, when a group of us became increasingly concerned about the proposal to dramatically extend Billy Bishop Airport for jets and introduce jets into the inner harbor. 6 of us came together. So myself, David Powell, Cameron Charlebois, Paul Bedford, whom I see is attending tonight, Ann Golden, and Helen Burston. And the catalyst for us coming together was a very comprehensive report and analysis done by David Powell in our group of the impacts that expansion of the airport would have. We came from very different backgrounds, but we all shared the same concern. And it wasn't that we had the answers, but we were really very surprised by how many fundamental important questions were not being asked. There was no detailed plan, no business case, no assessment of impacts, and no public discussion of the trade-offs would be involved. So we decided to create the reality check. And the name was deliberately chosen because what we're really asking for is evidence, transparency, and informed public debate before any decisions are made that could reshape Toronto's waterfront for generations. Toronto's waterfront is undeniably one of the great city building achievements in North America. It represents more than half a century of work by governments, communities, Indigenous partners, the private sector, and civic leaders. And for the past 25 years, the effort has been guided by Waterfront Toronto, supported by the 3 orders of government: municipal, provincial, and federal. Literally billions of dollars have been invested to transform our waterfront from a declining industrial harbor into one of the most successful urban waterfronts anywhere. And our contention is that once physical changes are made, they cannot be easily reversed. That is our insistence that answers must come before those decisions are made. We put out the website. We created a letter to the Prime Minister, to members of the Cabinet, and to the 23 members of the Liberal caucus. And we were really encouraged by the breadth of support that we got. So in addition to ourselves, the 6 of us, there are 28 prominent Canadians who signed our letter to the Prime Minister, and they include 17 members of the Order of Canada and some of the Order of Ontario, 3 former chairs of Waterfront Toronto, and a former Waterfront Toronto CEO. Former mayors, city builders, business leaders, cultural leaders, planners, physicians, and community leaders. People such as Margaret Atwood, David Crombie, Jennifer Keesmaat, Bob Ray, Shirley Bloomberg, Alan Broadbent, Haley Wickenhauser, and many others from across the political spectrum. These signatories do not agree on everything, but what they do agree on is that something this consequential deserves careful scrutiny and an open public process. And Edward has already mentioned our website, which we would encourage you to have a look at, where you can actually see the reality check itself, an executive summary, and the letter that we sent to the Prime Minister and members of Parliament. So what are we asking for? Our request is actually very simple. Show us the plan. Show us the evidence. Explain the impacts on residents, public health, housing, parks, the waterfront economy, and future city building opportunities. What we are saying is before any decisions are made that could alter Toronto's waterfront forever, shouldn't we know exactly what we are being asked to say yes to? To be clear, we are not arguing for closing Billy Bishop Airport. We are not opposed to aviation. The question is scale and balance. The airport and the waterfront coexist today. The question is whether an airport potentially handling up to 10 million passengers fundamentally upsets that balance. So the first big question is, what exactly is being proposed? And we don't know. There's an incredible absence of information. In fact, I would say a shocking lack of information. No public business plan, no public financial analysis, no transportation plan, no environmental assessment, no implementation schedule, no explanation of who pays, no explanation of the required infrastructure, and no explanation of the implications for surrounding neighborhoods. So how can the public be asked to evaluate a proposal that has not actually been disclosed? And more surprising still is why in the survey that has been released by the Minister of Transport, why are all Canadians across the country being asked to express an opinion about the future of the Toronto waterfront based on this complete lack of information? The second big question is what damage is being done already, damage that is being done right now. So I want to focus in this talk on the hidden cost of uncertainty. Cities depend on confidence, investment depends on confidence, housing developers depend on confidence, improving public space depends on confidence. So all the projects on deck for the waterfront are now facing uncertainty. And those include Oakwomen-Minising, the East Bayfront, the Portlands, BBTCA Park, efforts to create new affordable housing, efforts to create cultural destinations, and in fact, all private investment. Developers who were poised to continuing to develop on the waterfront are asking, will the flight paths change? Will airport zoning regulations change? Will building heights be restricted? Will noise contours expand? Will future residents accept the conditions? And most significantly, will the area be livable? And that includes impacts of noise, of pollution, impacts on public health, and so on. So what's the result? Projects slow down, investment decisions are deferred, financing becomes more difficult, risk premiums increase. Event organizers are facing the same problem. Festivals, concerts, waterfront events, tourism programming, harbor activities are all facing the same uncertainty, and they need years in advance to make their plans. So the key question is, the waterfront doesn't need actual airport expansion to be damaged. The possibility of that expansion alone can stall momentum and do enormous harm. A third major question that has arisen is what happens to public health? The public health discussion has barely begun, but the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment has raised significant concerns regarding jet expansion at Billy Bishop Airport. Their concerns include ultrafine particles, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, noise pollution, and the associated health risks that they've identified in the medical literature include asthma, lung disease, cardiovascular disease, stroke, dementia, diabetes, pregnancy risks, child development impacts. So all these questions remain unanswered. And what are the cumulative public health impacts of introducing commercial jets right in the middle of Canada's largest city? I don't need to highlight the fact that having such a jet port in the middle of a highly dense urban environment is extremely unusual. And no one has answered those questions or even acknowledged them. A fourth question is, what kind of housing are we creating? It would be what we're now learning, the sealed window city. one of the most troubling issues is already on the public record. The Port Authority has recommended enhancing acoustic projection measures for nearby residential development, including non-openable windows and noise warning clauses to be required in leases and purchase and sale contracts. Tens of thousands of people are expected to live on the waterfront, and many already do. The city's report to council estimates that some 300,000 people could be affected, not only including housing around the harbor, but also south of Etobicoke. So is our vision of waterfront living to live in hermetically sealed buildings with residents warned about airport noise, jets flying overhead every 2.5 minutes, balconies becoming non-existent or unusable, and constant reliance on mechanical ventilation instead of fresh air? Is this really the future we want for Toronto's waterfront neighborhoods? A fifth and very significant question is there even a need? Why is this proposal coming forward? What we know is that Pearson is also making a major expansion, as announced by the federal government. Hamilton exists, Waterloo exists, other regional airports exist. Transport Canada's own studies have previously concluded that the regional system has substantial available capacity. So what problem is this proposal meant to solve? And where is the evidence? So the conclusion is this debate is not really about airplanes. It's about the future of Toronto's waterfront. For more than 2 generations, including the 25 years with the guidance of Waterfront Toronto, supported by all 3 levels of government, by communities, by private investors, and by citizens, we have had a cooperative effort working together to create one of North America's most successful waterfronts. The burden of proof to introduce fundamental changes should be extremely high, not because airports are necessarily bad or because aviation is bad, but because the waterfront is a unique civic asset and because the consequences could be irreversible. Why should Toronto place one of its greatest city building achievements in limbo for 6 months, a year, or longer while waiting for a business plan that does not yet exist? And the time frame to create that business plan keeps being extended. Uncertainty has a cost. It is measured in delayed housing, deferred investment, postponed events, lost confidence, and lost momentum. And all of those effects are already being felt today. We were concerned that the fix might already be in, that the federal and provincial governments were quietly aligned on moving ahead with jet expansion. And there was a lot of evidence suggesting that assumption. What we are now hearing most recently is that the federal government has been shaken by the public response that has already occurred and by the opposition coming from many different sectors. We have also learned that there actually may be a decision within the next week or so. And the encouraging news is that there might be a roughly 50-50 chance that the federal government could back away from the proposal. However, there is also a less satisfactory income that could occur. Instead of rejecting the proposal outright, the government could simply say, this is not the time, call for more study, and kick the can down the road. This could literally mean years of delay, potentially until even the next provincial election happens, which would push it out to 2029. And that delay creates its own problem, the cost of uncertainty. Developers hesitate, investors wait, community planning stalls, the waterfront remains in limbo. If Ottawa does pull back, as we hope, my final point is that our work is not finished. Our next objective should be clear: end the uncertainty and secure a definitive decision. Our waterfront deserves and needs clarity, and not another 3 years of uncertainty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken. I appreciate that. That was a very good, very, very, very good. Um, I know someone mentioned that, why is Transport Canada not weighed in? And my first cut on that is that of course there's no public plan presented to them to review, right? Transport Canada has to review a detailed plan, and there isn't to date, unless you saw one somewhere hidden in a brown manila envelope back in. To date, there is no such thing, right?
So what was really surprising is that the Prime Minister and many members of the Liberal caucus were saying that and continue to say that. But at the same time, Steve McKinnon, the Minister of Transport, released this survey, which is asking all Canadians to express an opinion about the Toronto waterfront and the airport without a plan. So to me, that's an obvious contradiction.
Um, I would say, from what I know, thank you for sharing some of the things you've heard. I would say, from what I heard, that in part the perhaps flawed as it is, the questionnaire and the survey are indeed in part a response from things that the Toronto Liberal caucus has said, in private to the Prime Minister's office and to the Minister of Transportation. Um, I just wanted to mention, since we mentioned it, July 24th is the last day to fill out that survey and questionnaire. Flawed as some people have felt, with good reason that it may be, it does have a number of open-ended questions where you are free to, in fact, say whatever you would like. And if you haven't, I would strongly encourage you to fill it out, because indeed, you might as well. Any chance you have to express your opinion however, problematic, is one that I think we all recommend you take, right? Ken, would you agree it's worth filling out regardless?
Yeah, I think what's worth filling out are the points where you can make additional comments, because the 8-minute survey itself is skewed to present the expansion as inevitable. And, what colors of wallpaper would you like on the
Yeah.
building, which is going to be built anyway?
Will there be a champagne lounge in the terminal?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure everything hangs on that. Well, Ken, thank you very much. Don't go anywhere. We hope you'll hang around for a while. And I would like to um, introduce, for those of you who don't know, our esteemed chair, Ed Hore. Ed has been involved in Waterfront for All, one of the founders of Waterfront for All. He was involved, played a leading role in the original and successful No Jets fight in, well over a decade ago. And I would like to ask Ed to share observations, insights, and comments, please.
Thanks very much, Edward, and thanks very much, Ken, for your remarks. I just thought I'd mention a few things about the city report, which Ken briefly referred to. It's important, I think, because it's the first sort of report by some kind of, serious fact-finding, the first serious fact-finding effort to try to get to the bottom of what would be the impacts of the city. And therefore, it's worth looking at. People who've been involved in this or have listened to our previous speaker events will know that there was an EA that said there are a whole bunch of adverse consequences of the last jet proposal, which included jet blast barriers and so on out in the middle of the harbor, and very bad effects on the waterfront. It would change the look and feel of the waterfront and so on. This was coming from the Toronto Port Authority's own experts. And that document came to light fairly soon. We've talked about that previously. There was also a report by Air Canada's consultants back in 2015 by a firm called Oliver Wyman, who were aeronautical consultants, saying basically that expanding the island airport was not a feasible plan. The ground space there is simply too small to support the necessary infrastructure. And making some observations about what would be necessary, including the fact that there would need to be runway approach lighting, which might extend somewhere around 750 meters out at either end of the runway. So these were pretty shocking things, which seem to be fairly clear. They came from authoritative sources and so on, and kind of gave us some insight into the past jet proposal. And then we got a new jet proposal, as you know, and that happened in February or March of this year, but we still have no details. City Council has now taken a really key role of trying to find out really more about it and what are the implications. And this is important because the federal government seems to have no curiosity about that at all, which is very curious. Nobody is saying, well, what would be the effects on Toronto? What would be the costs? What would be the benefits? Why are we doing it? That kind of thing. The provincial government, of course, is not interested in those questions at all. So that leaves the city as the kind of adult in the room, the party that really has to try to find out the facts such as they are. And I would say that they've so far done an excellent job on that, partly due to motions brought by Josh Matlow, to some extent by Ozma Malik. And so city staff is saying, have released this report, and they're going to be releasing other reports, which I'll get to in a minute. But the important points about this report, and it was presented at the Planning and Housing Committee on June 11th, are that there's, as Ken said, enormous uncertainty about this because there have been no detailed plans submitted. The city, in fact, learned about the proposal from the newspapers. They were never given any information about it by Toronto Port Authority beforehand. This is oddly reminiscent of the previous JETS proposal, where it went on for 2.5 years and there was never any detailed plan submitted to Transport Canada as to what the jet proposal would actually look like, which is astonishing. There was no way to really assess what the impacts were. Everybody had to guess. And you would have thought that after that exercise, the entire thing would kind of, the credibility of the airport folks would sort of be reduced, because everybody would say, well, get serious. If you want to do this, please tell us what's actually involved. But that hasn't happened this time either. So the city goes through it and they note the lack of information. And they make a number of, they mention the jet blast barriers, the possibility of sound barriers, the stuff that we've already discussed that was in the environmental assessment back in 2017. And then they talk a little bit about the impact on planning. And what they say is, well, we can't really get to the bottom of it now, but they talk about the effects on housing. And I guess the way to summarize it would be this. There are a number of levels of regulation and rules that surround an airport. One is what's called the airport zoning regulations. Those are fairly clear. They're sort of like property in the sky. There's a clear property line. The airport, you can't build anything within this zone, which is very specifically defined. That is, it would be contrary to the law to do it. It's under federal regulations. It's very specifically defined. There's a somewhat lesser defined area, which is what's called instrument flight procedures, which are regulated by a different body called NAV Canada. Those are more discretionary. They change over time. And so the problem there is that you've got the clearly defined area, the airport zoning regulations, which you may have seen in our previous episodes, there are sort of specifically defined areas in the sky and so on. Then you have these rather fuzzy areas, which may be outside the airport zoning regulations, where it becomes somewhat unclear and changes over time because the approach procedures change over time as the obstacles change and as the technology changes and so on. So in 2014, they said, well, there seem to be some obstructions in the airport zoning regulations, but here's what they are as we understand it. The city dealt with the Toronto Port Authority. They tried to sort of settle what those are and get clear. At that time, the EA said, well, they are this. These are the minimum areas that are protected not only by the airport zoning regulations, but also by these other flight procedures. That appears in the report, a graphic of that. And then over the years, it sort of got wider and wider because they said, no, you can't build this, can't build that. NAV Canada doesn't have the power to say you can't build that, but they have a kind of a discretionary ability to say very nicely, would you please not build there? And that's fine. The city tried to work with them, but the Toronto Port Authority never said, hey, we're planning to have jets. They said, in fact, no, we're not actually. We agree with the assessment that was made 10 years ago. We shouldn't have jets. We're just going to try to deal and normalize the normal operation as we're going now. And there's these conflicts, let's try to work with them. The city worked with them in good faith on that and discovered and tried to work it out, had settlement discussions and ongoing negotiations, and discovered to its shock in May that, in fact, the Toronto Port Authority plans to make huge changes, never previously disclosed to the city. A 640 or more extension going out to the west, another extension going out to the east. Nobody knows what the change to the airport zoning regulations would be. It's impossible to assess it because what has to happen is Toronto Port Authority has to make an application to change it. And in order to do that, they've got to file stuff with Transport Canada. In Vancouver, there's been an effort to change the airport zoning regulations that started in 2014, and it's still going on now, 12 years later. So Ken said, well, we might be uncertain, for 6 months or a year. Actually, it could be a decade. It could be longer. If you want to change the airport zoning regulations, there's a consultation process. It's highly technical. It's something that the airport folks, Billy Bishop, would have had to start on and work on an ongoing basis for decades. But they haven't done that. They just announced all of a sudden, we're going to do this. So city staff in this report are attempting to grapple with what does that mean? And they say, as far as we can figure out, as Ken said, it affects the highest growth areas in the city. Somewhere around 300,000 people. Perhaps 175,000 is the expected growth in those areas. And we don't know what kind of flight procedures will be, and we have no idea what the airport zoning regulations will be that will be necessary for jets. The necessary regulations, so it's actually a guideline, is what's called TP 312. This changed. If you change the airport, it's sort of grandfathered. They're under the old rules now. If they change the airport, they have to. All of a sudden, the new rules apply, and that means massive changes. Nobody knows what they are. So, in addition to all of the concerns that we had before about, lights in the harbor and so on and so forth, we've got a totally new world coming, and there appears to have been no homework done by Toronto Port Authority as to what the plan is. When they're asked, do you have a plan? I assume the Ford government didn't know. They didn't have a plan. I don't know that. Because it turns out they said, oh, sorry, we don't have a plan. What have they been doing for the last 10 years? Nobody knows. They should have been working on this for 20 years, maybe 30 years, but they haven't been doing it. So I would say that the the level of uncertainty we've got actually will carry on for decades. There's been a letter. They've seemed to have become more aggressive about what are called the flight, as I said, the instrument flight procedures, the slightly discretionary areas outside the airport zoning. They've sent a letter. They've said all the buildings in Ucum and Minising, which are now being discussed, would have to have interior ventilation because you wouldn't want to have people open the windows. And they'd have to have lots of sound protection. That means you have to build them differently. Presumably people wouldn't go out on their balconies. They wouldn't want to, or you wouldn't have balconies, who knows? It affects not only the height of the buildings, but also the nature of the buildings. And it affects planning decisions, therefore, not only in Ucum and Minising, but also across the central waterfront, the area around Bathurst Quay, and also the area in South Etobicoke. Potentially thousands of people are addressed by it. Many planning applications have already been objected to by NAV Canada, and presumably the number will greatly increase if you have jets. And nobody has any idea what the consequences of that are. So it would seem to me that it is time for the federal government to say to these guys, get serious, have a plan, and tell us what the reason for it is, what it's going to look like, when you're filing the stuff with Transport Canada, how long it's going to take for them to make decisions about what it means. And why do you need it? And we're expanding Pearson, as you know. What's the business case? What's the reason? What problem does it solve, as Ken said? Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks very much. I appreciate that. We've got a couple questions here. Yes, some questions about the Port Authority. Ed, do you want to talk to that about how people get on the Port Authority and what the current with the situation with the board right now?
The Toronto Port Authority is it's a port authority under what's called the Canada Marine Act. And it has a board. The board is supposed to have local representatives on it and so on. There are 5 vacancies on the board right now. We don't exactly know why. For some reason, the federal government isn't filling them. It is its own revenues. It is self-sufficient. It tries to make money out of the airport. That is presumably why it wants to expand the airport, is to bring in more income because it's got dropping numbers of passengers. Oh, there's one other thing. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this before. I just wanted to deal a little bit briefly with what the reports are that are coming. There are a number of them, and here they are. There's ownership and controlling interest of Newport Aviation that city staff is working on. They're going to report on that at the next Planning and Housing Committee, which is on July 16th. Public health impacts of the proposed expansion on water quality is another one that will be at the next Planning and Housing Committee meeting. I think we may have talked about that at a previous meeting. Basically, if you extend the runway, you reduce the flushing into the harbor. What are the consequences of that? Public health impacts is a report that they're working on as well. I don't have a time frame. I don't know the time frame as to when that will be done. I'm hoping they will not rush that one. I think that's probably the most important of all. An impact assessment on the expropriation of Little Norway Park, per the council. Council asked for that on April 22nd and 23rd. Again, nobody knows, so it's probably going to be difficult to say much in that report. They've dealt with transportation impacts and issues on the city side in the existing report, insofar as they can. Which is, they can't say a lot because nobody knows anything. Nobody knows who would pay for the changes. For example, one of the things they mentioned in the report is there are 219 parking spots on the city side at Billy Bishop. Nobody has any idea how many spots you would need. Presumably, many, many more. A lot. At one point, they say that the number of peak hour trips that are made now are 480 That's about half of pre-COVID levels because the number of passengers at the airport, of course, dropped off quite a lot. And they estimate in the report that that would become 5,500. Now, that was increased by more than tenfold. They say, well, obviously we need a lot more infrastructure, but of course nobody knows what it would be, or who would pay for it, or what the effects would be on the neighborhood. They mention in the May 28th report, which I described, that they have ongoing monitoring and reporting jet-related. They were looking to proposals, BBTCA governance, which might go to the question that was asked, and real estate ownership issues. So they see themselves as having an ongoing ability, an ongoing sort of responsibility to look into these issues more fully. So we'll look into those reports as they come out.
You know, Ed, you just mentioned parking, and I can't resist sharing this. So that's Indianapolis International. It has now. I think it's and Ron. I think is it about? I think it's about 8 or 9 million passengers a year. It's not quite 10 million, but it's in the range. Now, obviously, it's a different context, and one far more appropriate for an airport because it's out in the middle of a field outside of the city. But this is this is just gives you a glimpse of the kind of parking level, parking space. Now, it's not a garage, which would be more compact, but also very large. But well, there's actually a garage at the front. But that is indeed the kind of parking that you have for an airport with up to 10 million passengers per year. Ron, did you I think you had some things to say. Ron Jenkins, who's our board member, a longtime expert on things to do with the waterfront, originally part of the original successful No Jets campaign, and knows far too much about ferries back and forth to the island. He's given us some wonderful talks on the history of the airport, history of the ferries, and the ways we've gotten to and from the island.
Yeah, thank you. I'll give you a bit of a slideshow, which maybe at the outset won't seem on topic, but I hope it does bend to that eventually. I'll start there. I hope you can see my screen. So this is a creature that knows very well what the implications are of changes on the waterfront. This is a piping plover chick at Hanlon's Beach, and it's cursing Doug Ford. It's cursing Doug Ford because of what Doug Ford is doing to its cousins up on Wasaga Beach, which I won't go into because that would be a sidelight that we don't need at the moment. But I'll start with the 2017 Toronto Port Authority environmental assessment of the Porter proposal. It was hidden from us for a long time. This seems to be a Port Authority strategy, hide the ball. It was completed in September 2017 and included a section on natural environment effects. And that was an interesting section. What it does talk about are the airport wildlife management plans. These are mandated by Transport Canada for all airports, and they're different for every airport, but they focus on mitigation and management. That is to say, managing habitat so that you don't get, for example, incitements for animals to live along the waterfront edge or birds to inhabit there, population monitoring and control and population dispersal, just to discourage wildlife from seeking food, water, shelter, and so on near the airport property. And Transport Canada has a whole lot of regulations about this sort of thing. I won't go into the details there, but this will appear later on the Waterfront for All website, so you can see it there. avian concerns at Billy Bishop are threefold. Concern about bird strikes, concern about endangered species and species at risk, and concern about the effect of the airport on migratory routes. The on-site Billy Bishop Wildlife Management Plan includes falconry, which is actually using trained birds to scare away the birds that would pose hazards to aircraft. Canine hazing. These are dogs that are used to chase away wild waterfowl. I haven't seen those. And I spend enough time near the airport that I might have. But in any case, habitat management, keeping things clean and tidy so that birds don't nest or and so on, and daily monitoring, which you do see. You'll see pickup trucks driving down to the end of the runway and firing off fireworks to scare the birds away and things like that. That environmental assessment did include bird survey zones surrounding the airport. You can look at detail in this environmental assessment, but this is the immediate vicinity of the airport. It's also the case that, and this is from the same environmental assessment, that there are what are called bird hazard zones. And those are Transport Canada creations. And they're vast in size. In the vicinity of the Billy Bishop, you go 2 kilometers on each side of the runway and you widen out in the eastern boundaries, 9 kilometers, which basically encompasses everything from south of Etobicoke out into Scarborough. And then you go to the secondary bird hazard zone, which reaches into Mississauga and goes a long way east. And the issue with these bird hazard zones is what they enable airport interests to do. If they perceive a problem, they can act on it. So what you're seeing here is even in the primary bird hazard zone, it's already reaching all the way across Humber Bay into the Humber River, the south end of the Humber River. It's encompassing all of Toronto Island and most of the Leslie Street Spit, reaching up the Don Valley, and so on. These things are all areas where the airport can exercise some type of authority. And the environmental assessment does say that there's an uncertainty in the study area. It says future conditions in the terrestrial environment study area generally cannot be easily predicted with certainty due to the number of confounding variables. And those variables are things like possible habitat creation, and they refer to the lower Donlands, the downmouth. And remember, this was written in 2015, 2016, 2017, before, BBTCA Park was created, which would be a nesting site for many of these birds. They're also talking about the management of double-breasted cormorants on the Leslie Street Spit, and those cormorants have now actually largely relocated even closer to the airport in the area of Muggs Island on the Toronto Islands. The city has instituted a bunch of environmentally sensitive areas. I won't go into that detail now, but there are a bunch. And of course, you have changes resulting from climate change and changes in human activity. So the bottom line in the Toronto Port Authority's environmental assessment, and it pointed out a couple of problems in that assessment of that expansion proposal, that the increased number of total annual aircraft movements may result in increased risk to birds, and including species at risk and species of critical concern near the Billy Bishop airport grounds. And they say also, in the unlikely event that damaging strikes with aircraft cause aviation safety concerns, off-ground wildlife management could be considered by Billy Bishop to mitigate or minimize wildlife hazardous risk. Off-ground wildlife management is the reaching out from the basic area around the airport in that first map that I showed you to the bird hazard zones that are created by Transport Canada. Now, some of this relates to jets. Some of that relates to turboprops. The Porter proposal was about jets. And I'll just give you a little blast from the past here. This is from January 2009. Robert DeLuce, the CEO of Porter Airlines, said, "We're using turboprops. They handle bird strikes better than jets." He was saying that up until when he wanted jets. And then we've got a picture of him standing here, on the verge of being sucked in, but not quite. When an aircraft hits a bird, they send the aviation authority sends stuff to this place. Toronto Transport Canada cooperates with the Smithsonian Feather Identification Lab, and they've got literally millions of birds in their inventory, and they receive more than 10,000 bird strike packages a year. This lab can tell what kind of bird it was. If you remember the Miracle on the Hudson, that jet that was taken down by a bunch of Canada geese. There's one right back there. They identified that. In fact, they will have biological material in their storage from that particular
Hi, Mira.
bird. And
Yeah, no worries. I've got to talk quickly because I'm in the middle of a Zoom thing.
yeah, so
There's
gotta mute
I
yourself.
wondered if you'd like
Okay.
to try. There's a
Who's that?
beginner
Okay.
learn
gonna-
to play badminton on Sunday.
Okay, you're going to have to unmute yourself, Ron, because I have to do the override mute all. So just unmute
Okay,
yourself, Ron.
I'm back on now, I think.
Back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Yeah, so these people receive stuff from Transport Canada, not just from the American system. They identify the birds, and because they have a historical view also, they can identify climate change effects and so on as well. And they use both feather identification, but also DNA. So, they had some material sent to them, and they were a little puzzled because at 1,500 feet, their DNA evidence said that the pilot had struck a deer. They went back to the pilot and said, "Was this what happened there?" And eventually they sorted it out. It was a vulture that had eaten some deer and had then been hit by the aircraft. So this whole thing is very important because identifying birds and altitudes at which birds are struck and types of birds is all used to create these zones around airports. She's the head, Carla Dove. Yeah, that's her name. So we have a little micro case study here, the piping plovers at Hanlan's Beach. This is in the environmental assessment, talking about the piping plover and saying it was last observed on Hanlan's Beach in 1934, not recorded in their studies by ACOM and Falcon Environmental, but we do know differently. This was 2015 when piping plovers were under protection by the Canadian Wildlife Service, the TRCA, Toronto Parks, and so on. Once a breeding site was recognized there, you can see Hotel X under construction in the background. That's the end of the case study. But next, we talked just briefly about the City of Toronto, Toronto Island Park Master Plan. In 2024, the city came out with this Island Park Master Plan, and among other things, it talks a little bit about the airport lands and says there will be a number of important considerations to take into account as part of any future public consultation and tripartite agreement review process, including the compatibility of an airport in close proximity to several significant and impacted natural areas, and the economic and strategic advantages for the continued operation of the airport. Well, it's kind of with a feeling of nostalgia that I read the city talking about any of this stuff in the context of the current politics, because this master plan is completely thrown into disarray. Here's the master plan looking 20 plus years down the way for what will go on Toronto Island. And basically you can say, how much of that is possible? How much of that is actually going to happen? We don't know. But we do know that the province has instituted Bill 5, the Special Economic Zones Act, to override environmental protections. And we also know that the province instituted Bill 110, the Building Billy Bishop Airport Act, where they created a claim on a property identification region called 21,386, which is essentially all of Toronto Island that is not the residential enclaves in the east. So now, what should the city do in planning? It looks like it can't do anything. It has to wait. It's got a plan that it can't implement. We don't know what the province actually intends to do with all this land, if anything, or whether they're interested primarily in the pieces of land that are within the existing airport boundary. They haven't cultivated a sense of trust. So we have assorted uncertainties arising just from this one subtopic, bird management, related to park planning. The affected entities are the City of Toronto, Waterfront Toronto, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, caused by provincial bills. We have proposed investment in infrastructure that may well go on hold by the TRCA for the same reasons. We have a crimp put into long-term civic planning by the city because of the Port Authority, the Department of Transport, and the Office of the Prime Minister. At this point, things are still unclear. We have the treatment of the Billy Bishop on-site birds, which is the local affected group of the birds on the site and nearby, but those management plans can change. And then we have, of course, the treatment of off-site birds, wetland development, and so on. All of that stuff, all of that work has to be stalled by provincial action and action by the Toronto Port Authority. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate that. So everyone, thanks very much. I actually have a couple of things that I'd like to show you that highlight the things we've already been talking about. And I will just, so this is an image from the City of Toronto report. I've shared the staff link a couple of times in the chat. We can share it again. So this is from the city staff report. About 300,000 residents are expected to be in the broad sweep of the waterfront. And so this just shows you, I mean, it's a lot of detail. And again, you can see it in the staff report, and we'll also share some of this information at waterfrontforall.ca and in a more comprehensible bits in the coming next couple of days. and but this shows you the sort of sweep of the concern about potentially impacted by runway extensions. So these are a variety of building heights and building areas, including, of course, south of Tobico, well through the Portlands potentially, and there is, and of course along the downtown core. This basically, this is an AI generated image, but it gives you a vague idea of the fact that there has to be an area provided for flight, for instrument flight, and for flight. This is just giving you a very crude example of that. So, and part of this is because there are the regulations the airport operates under now are not entirely consistent with the new regulations that would come into play if jets were to be at the island airport, which changes flight paths and the heights that buildings have to be out of the way of missed approaches when an airplane has to swerve off because something's wrong, or there's, I don't know, something's on the runway, etc. There are a whole host of regulations which have been alluded to already around that. And part of this, one way of simply putting this is that it doesn't really fit. There is also the infamous object limitation surfaces, which define how tall things can be according to the TP 312 version 5 regulations. This illustrates a variety of concerns in terms of heights. It shows you conceptually some of the tall buildings that are planned, proposed, suggested, a mixture of all three for parts of the Portlands, and and it has and again the current Portlands, which we'll get to in a second. It is it works whether one likes the current airport or not. What has been so far approved for the Portlands fits with the current airport. There is absolutely no certainty that it would fit with an expanded jet operations. So the city report talks about 86,000 units that will be in the, potentially in the shadow of areas that would be affected by flight paths, object surface limitations, missed approach angles, etc. The city, suggested it's a very significant disruption to current planning, as Ron and Ed and Ken have alluded to. Even perhaps more stunningly, is it affects a further up to at least another 10 to 12,000, 8,000 more homes that are potentially underway because of the fact. And that, of course, on the one hand, I know the Port Authority said, "Oh, don't worry, we're going to put the runway. It's going to extend out west." Well, that of course pushes these kinds of concerns about surface limitations, building heights, affected areas, and quality of life, which I'll get to in a second, and which Ken spoke to. It actually has the effect of pushing it westward. It doesn't really benefit. It doesn't remove the challenge from revitalizing the Portlands, but it takes the challenge and pushes it farther west. This is an illustration of what's been approved at Oakham and Minising, formerly known as Villiers Island. This was approved in most recently last month for final approvals. And again, this has been designed in such a way that it fits with current operations at Billy Bishop. In fact, Ron, am I right that the line is it's just roughly where the river is? Is that right? Where the sort of edge is right now?
It's upward sloping.
Upward sloping?
So yeah.
So
So you'll see taller buildings in the north and
yeah. So that's why it's that's the geometry, right?
Yeah.
So if height limits were to significantly change, this radically affects the ability to deliver affordable housing. Like most mixed income communities, this whole program relies on a mixture of, middle income housing, some upper income housing, and purpose built affordable housing. And if you take, one of the blocks like Jenga, if you take one of the blocks away, the whole thing starts to crumble, and the math doesn't math. One of the advantages, and one of the great advantages of the Portlands, is that much of the land is publicly owned. So we don't have to buy it, because of course, when you're constructing new housing, be it affordable housing, be it luxury condos and everything in between, your first, your first cost would normally be land cost if you have to purchase it. And of course, the city can excuse itself. I mean, we've already seen some money coming in from the federal government via the province to the city to compensate the city, to allow it to reduce development charges with which is a tax you pay if you're going to build something. Now, this is particularly important for affordable housing projects, which are sometimes entirely exempted from that cost. I mean, this is a good, but again, if you have to change this and if you have to change heights, the math doesn't math anymore, and you put at risk the ability to deliver a minimum, 3,000 new affordable homes, and perhaps even more, depending on funding as Oakland and Minising develops. Just another thing. I mean, in fact, those who pushed this before already suggested that the initial plans from years ago were the buildings were too tall. Well, what one of the ironies is when Rob and Doug Ford intervened infamously in the Portland's planning process, they showed a picture of their mega mall, their Ferris wheel, and tall buildings everywhere in the Portlands, like from the Ship Channel all the way up to Keating Channel. Just a side note. I find that a kind of unfortunate, a sort of rather sad irony. And this was referred to. So this is a letter. I know you can't really read it, but it's a letter that Seenstra, the president and chief executive officer of the Toronto Port Authority, sent to the city on May 6th, basically saying, hang on a second. We're going to have to think about how buildings are built and what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. And Ken mentioned this. So, for example, if you're building a building, even if the height's okay, even if you can build it to the X height, if you're building it close to an airport, a flight path, planes going by you all the time, there are additional considerations. For example, sealed buildings, HVAC, windows that don't open, glass encased rather than open balconies, acoustic, armor, additional soundproofing, basically. Of course, needless to say, besides even before we even think about the quality of life impacts this would have on people who might live in a building like this if it were built, it of course also would significantly raise the cost. And if you raise the cost of building, you make delivering affordable housing harder and more expensive. So it's generally speaking. This is another visualization of that. So yes, your lovely balcony here has an X on it because you can't have it anymore. And so this affects, we were chatting just before we started the meeting, this affects potential quality of life in any structure you would build in an area that would be affected by airport zoning regulations, whether it be, the affordable rent geared to income household or whether it be the $2 million luxury penthouse. It doesn't matter. Either way, you're creating a situation where who would want to live here? Even if you can build, a 20-story apartment building, and even if you fill it with like family-size units and you make it work financially, who would want to live in this environment? And I mean, I suppose, and why would you do it? And those are questions we don't have good answers for. So there's a whole bunch of public health concerns. There's additional pollution concerns. There's the noise, the impact, the physical limitations, the requirements to build extra soundproof buildings, etc. And of course, this affects market viability because about 70% of the buildings will be some form of market, from low-end market to high-end market and everything in between. So whatever one thinks of developers, they look at things like this and go, yeah, the math doesn't math, we're not going forward, which puts the entire project of revitalizing Oakland and Minising at risk, and a great deal of uncertainty. Like everything we've been talking about, Ken and Ed and Ron, this is a very huge layer of uncertainty, which is ironic because, of course, at the same time, the federal government has put billions of dollars on the table to build lower end of market rental and purpose-built affordable rental. And they, of course, already have put billions into the creation of Oakland and Minising and the flood protection through Waterfront Toronto. And of course, they have agreed to fund a massively large part of the Waterfront LRT, which we've been all waiting for it seems like a generation. So that's another, element of uncertainty and contradiction in all of this. Yeah, so this is a potential notion that could affect 94,000 housing units, farm and 300,000 people, and significantly impair the waterfront that we all love and enjoy, and that we want to see economically, sustainably, and environmentally redeveloped, revitalized, and maintained. So thank you. Thank you for that. I will look in it. Now, my first shout out is there are some notable folks here people who've joined us before. Paul Bedford, hi. Hi, Paul. If you want to unmute yourself, if you have any comments or additional insights, I'm sure we'd be thrilled to hear them.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank Ken for all his hard work and excellent presentation tonight and all the other comments of everyone. I guess the only thing I would add is, as a member of the group that Ken mentioned, one of the things I've done is done a lot of outreach to all of the resident associations in the city. And people may know there's 4 federations. There's the Federation of South Toronto Resident Associations, North Toronto Resident Associations, the Coalition of Etobicoke Residents, and finally the Scarborough United Neighborhoods. I've sent our website, the torealitycheck.ca, to all of those federations, who have in turn distributed our material to each of their member associations. In total, there are over 100 resident associations in the city. So far, I have heard back mainly in very strong term from the Federation of South Toronto Resident Associations. They have in turn prepared their own policy brief, about 5 pages, and totally opposed for all the reasons we've heard tonight. So that is all in the works. The second thing, and you mentioned this, Edward, and I want to highlight it. You had that slide of the Indianapolis airport,
Yep.
which was roughly 10 million passengers. For people who have never been in Indianapolis, Edmonton and Ottawa are good comparisons in Canada. They have a total passenger volume in the order of 8 to 10 million per year. And if anyone has been to either Edmonton or Ottawa, the obvious observation is the massive amount of support infrastructure needed to make those airports function. And you mentioned parking, which is obvious, but also taxiways, expanded terminal, additional gates, de-icing facilities, obviously, all kinds of additional support infrastructure needed that, frankly, is just impossible to accommodate on the existing site of 210 acres. But even if you look at all of the Toronto Islands together, that's 820 acres. Edmonton and Ottawa have land areas in the order of 6,000 to 7,000 acres. So it's a completely different situation. So I think that's important to understand. And the final observation, I guess I'd add to the mix tonight.
Oh, sorry, Paul, there's Ottawa.
Oh,
That's
good.
an overview of the Ottawa airport.
Yeah, I think most people, or a lot of people, probably have flown in and out of there. And you can imagine something of that magnitude being superimposed on the waterfront. It just doesn't fit and it doesn't make any sense. The last observation I want to make is, and it's been referred to, but it's the land side implications and the water side implications. The land side, when you come down Lower Bathurst, of course, Little Norway Park is involved. There's the school, the community center. Um, it's very constrained. There is not a lot of room. The pressure to make transportation successfully function there would be enormous. There's no rapid transit other than the Harborfront streetcar line a block away. Um, and it would, in my opinion, raise the whole spectrum of the fixed link bridge over to the airport from Lower Bathurst Street again. Now, as many people know, I was chief planner for a long time in Toronto. And when the jets were last proposed, I fought and succeeded in killing the fixed link bridge concept. Um, that I think is something that really hasn't been mentioned, but the reality is you couldn't put parking garages on Lower Bathurst. You'd probably need to put them somewhere on the airport lands. And so that pressure, I think, would build for that bridge again, which would be disastrous for the whole neighborhood, but also would, of course, affect navigation in a substantial way. The Western Gap with a bridge that opened and closed and a lot of boat traffic through there would be a complete disaster. I guess the very last observation is about the water side, and Ed has great images on that. Regardless of how long the runway might be out into Lake Ontario or into the inner harbor, there would be, as we understand it, rows of navigation lights put in the water at the end of the runway extensions. And they would extend out even further. I've seen images that show that runway and the runway lights being extended out as far as Queens Quay Terminal in the inner harbor, for example. And of course, into the lake, we've already seen an image where it goes out past Ontario Place and the supposed new spa, which I can't help but have one observation. If that former Budweiser stage, I think it's the RBC facility, the amphitheater, is going to have major concerts there, they would be right at the end of this extended runway. So noise and interference are pretty obvious with that. And navigation, finally, if the runway was extended way out into the lake, as shown in Ed's slide, basically that Western Gap area, the opening would be so small, it would probably limit a lot of vessels from entering into the Western Gap to access the inner harbor. They'd have to go around the island and go through the Eastern Gap. So those are just some of the additional observations. This is like a giant puzzle, and every time you pick up a piece, there are other pieces related to it. And it is a proposal that, in my opinion, just does not belong, doesn't make sense for all the reasons that have been stated. People go to the waterfront not to watch jets land and take off. They go down there to enjoy themselves, to sit by the water, to see, feel, touch, and experience being by a big body of water and watching all the activities. So, this is a major fight and a lot of people involved, and it's going to continue to grow. So I'm very encouraged by what Ken said, where the federal government is somewhat surprised by the level of opposition that they've heard so far. All I can say is they're going to hear an awful lot more.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate that.
I have a question, Paul.
Yes.
What account you've dealt as chief planner with other levels of government, I'm sure over the years, what accounts for the federal government's their lack of curiosity about the effects of this? How is it that they don't seem to even want to know what they are?
That's the obvious mystery. And given all the studies that we are aware of in the past that you've referred to, and what we are all talking about now, it's a gigantic mystery to me. It seems to be a concept that is based on very high level generalities. Well, it's good for business and people can land right near the financial district, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very thin arguments have been made so far with no studies, no information, no backup. The only other thing I can say, Ed, is that many of us have been in touch with our members of parliament, myself, of course, included, and some of them are starting to come out in pretty strong terms and saying, "Look, I share all your concerns. This can't happen," and I'm encouraged that more MPs will speak up, and that Ken's intelligence, I guess, from today is that this may get turned around. I don't want it delayed. It has to be killed. David Crombie often said to me, often you have to kill something 3 times before it's officially dead. Well, this is the third time.
Yep.
This is the third time. We don't want a fourth.
Ed, can I just add a comment? I think what all this adds up to, Ed Hore, your comments, Ron Jenkins, Edward, your illustrations, is that even if the federal government backs away from this, the damage of the specter of this happening, the uncertainty, will do almost as much damage as if the airport is actually expanded. And by analogy, this is like the Spadina Expressway moment. As long as the specter of the Spadina Expressway was there, it sterilized a whole part of the city. And until William Davis stood up in the Parliament in 1972 and said, "It's done," it wasn't possible to revitalize that whole part of the city. So if we want to proceed with this multi-generational societal plan of activating, renewing, revitalizing, making the most of our waterfront, we have to demand a definitive decision.
Absolutely. Questions, comments? You can put them in the chat or put your hand up if you'd like to.
I guess
ask a
while
question.
people are thinking about that, I'll just say that I've suggested Ron and I actually and Pam Mazza went to see Chi early on in this. It was sometime in April, and say, well, there's the EA, it says these things. There's the Oliver Wyman report that says the whole thing's unworkable, as Paul just said, not enough ground space, etc. Just be aware of these things. Can you pass these things on to your fellow MPs? And by the way, we've been kind of immersed in this for a long time, decade or so. We'd be happy to give a little briefing to your colleagues in the Toronto caucus, just saying, here are the reports. Here's what they say. This is not our opinion. This is what these sort of substantive reports say. And they never took us up on it. And I've offered again to Chi's office, and I would who am I? I mean, there's other people perhaps that could give the briefing better than I could. But it seems like it would be a good idea for somebody to brief these guys on just what these reports say. They say a bunch of things that are relevant, obviously, to the decision, and there aren't reports that say the opposite. There's no supporting material. There aren't supporting reports. There's nothing saying this is a good idea for whatever reason. So why is it that they don't want to know any of this stuff that we're talking about today? I am baffled by it. If somebody can say, hey, let's get them all in a room or go see them one by one or whatever, whether it's me or somebody else or Ken or whatever, Paul would be great. It would be great if they would do that because, in a half an hour presentation with these guys, you could say, just be aware of this and be aware of that. And this report said that and so on and so forth. And it seems to me we'd be just way further ahead. They'd know some things they don't know now. That might help.
Got a couple questions. Gail.
So just a few weeks ago, my NDP, Chris Glover, the 100 of us went by bus to try to meet with the Liberal MPs, and about 10 of us met with Chi. She denied that there were any reports that really shed light on the airport, and that, of course, she understood the problems, but you had to go through all these extra reports and research. Anyway, we just got the feeling that she was on a very, very short leash.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet Rob Oliphant and Salma Zahid have spoken out against it and said, why are we doing this when we're expanding Pearson? So there isn't, I would say it's a public observation that there isn't a unanimity among Liberal MPs in Toronto. Cindy.
Hi there.
Hi, Cindy.
Great session. Thanks very much. Just to the point, I think, Ed, that you were making moments ago, I'm wondering if one of the things Waterfront for All might be able to do is actually supplement the TO reality check comprehensive document, which is really readable. I encourage people to read it if they haven't. It's 23 pages, which looks daunting, but it's easy to read. It's really informative. But maybe it would be good to have a supplementary appendix which actually summarizes what the EA reports are. Like just a heading, a paragraph about sort of the conclusion, something that could be posted and also sent around to MPs. So getting an opportunity to do a presentation may be tough, but actually trying to provide a really, quick summary document that can be sent off along with the TO reality check document might be useful. If anyone, it sounds to me, Ed, as though you practically know it off by heart anyway. So,
Cindy, I think that's an excellent suggestion. We've talked about it internally a lot. We happen to have a kind of a graphics genius on our team. That's Jim Panu, who many of you will know, who does fantastic images that are really helpful. And we did similar documents 10 years ago. And we'll talk about it again. I think the answer is you're right, and we'll get on it.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Great. Well, thank you for coming, everyone. We are going to endeavor to, I like to under-promise and over-deliver, so I would say probably think the weekend. We may be able to do it by Friday. I'm not entirely sure. But we'll do it as soon as possible. What is it that we will do? We will put the recording of this on YouTube and on our website, waterfrontforall.ca. I've shared a number of times the Oliver Wyman study, the 2017 EA documents that were done. Those are actually all on our website. Have we put a link to the city staff report up there too? I think, yeah, we have.
We did.
Yeah, we did. So the city, and I've also shared that link around this evening. So if you go to waterfrontforall.ca/documents, many of the documents we've referred to this evening are there. And of course, we've shared the reality check TO document, and we should add that link on our website as well, just to reinforce that. Oh, Mark. Hi, Mark.
Hello. Just a couple of additional points if I could make them.
Excellent.
One is I continue to be surprised that Alto has not entered this conversation, the high-speed rail project. Just a day or so ago, the federal government was out front again promoting the new route that they wanted through Kingston. And the impact of Alto on the airport is pretty dramatic because the heart of their business, 30 to 40% of their flights are the Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal triangle. And that's the threat that they're facing, is in fact a dramatic drop in their revenues, in their passenger volumes. And so they're desperately looking for a new growth strategy, and that's jets. So I mean, that's my diagnosis of where all this is coming from. And I think, given the federal government's support of Alto and the Prime Minister's personal commitment to Alto, I think drawing attention to what's the proper role of Billy Bishop Airport, given that we get Alto, is a useful conversation, I think, at the federal government level, for those who are connected there. The second observation I'd make is that the Port Authority is putting forward some, things under the rubric of optimization or modernization, and you'll see those words in the Transport Canada survey. And part of what they're dealing with as well is that they're saying the planes that we have today are no longer in production. And so we need changes to the tripartite agreement even to continue to exist. And I think that's an argument we need to get after and at, because there are other turboprops being produced around the world. We don't have to have the Dash 8s. So again, I think in our messaging, we're saying, look, we recognize that you have issues that need to be dealt with, and we should deal with them. But within the context of the current constraints that the airport's under, it can continue. Technology changes can happen, and maybe those turboprops are quieter. I have no idea. But I think we should be dealing with that argument head on as well, from the Port Authority. So those are my two comments.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm really, really, really glad you said that. I think we sort of, we could have, there is so much more to talk about. But I appreciate that. I mean, I think a talk about Alto and a talk about all the other again, our premier perhaps could be argued to have done a number of things that have slow rolled or raised the cost unnecessarily of transit expansion. Yet, wearing my optimistic hat, they're still basically they're still more or less on track, including, GO expansion, including connections to Pearson Airport, etc. So there are great, and Alto is absolutely significant. So perhaps, I don't know, what do you think, Ed, Ron? Maybe we should do a follow-up session where we look at the transportation alternatives and infrastructure alternatives. I'm going to go back to Cindy, and if you want to unmute yourself, Cindy.
Yeah, I just wanted to make to reinforce what Mark just said. I've had two conversations with Julie DeBrusen, who's the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change and Nature, and my MP, and she has raised Alto in both of those conversations as an important factor to be considered. So I think it is very important, what Mark has suggested, to keep that as part of the conversation, and sort of look at what is the optimal kind of transportation network future. It isn't about expanding Billy Bishop. It's about getting those particular that particular piece in place, and then enhancing the connections with Pearson, I think.
Great, thanks. Corinne. I can't. You have to unmute yourself, Corinne. Corinne, you have to unmute yourself at your end there. Nope. Still, there you are.
I'm coming consciously from left field, with a respect for all of the data that I've heard over the past while and in the original discussion. But I wanted to look at the big picture of uncertainty of process. You have a premier, we have a premier who has had a record of a style of decision-making in his own business and now manifest in his way of going about governing us. So when I look at his lack of desire to ever plan anything, and that, of course, led to some unsuccessful businesses, and notably New Jersey. And then the presence of private equity money in his life in New York and New Jersey, in Chicago and New Jersey. I can't get out of my mind that the Newport, JP Morgan, et cetera, private equity presence is, influencing Ford's way of approaching this decision. It seems like he's acting exactly the same as he did in his own business. I sent a copy of the Globe and Mail analysis of all of this to Chi, our MP, and asked her to, have this in mind when she's considering what she has to say about the circumstances, because you always have to know who you're dealing with. And this is so irregular that it would benefit all of us, and particularly Chi, to have facts to show that this is exactly the same type of decision making that he has always engaged in, to a disastrous effect. And the other thing I would like to say is, do we all think that those 3 seats of the harbor, the Port Authority, should be filled? In which case, we should try to think of a remedy via mandamus to call upon someone bringing a mandamus to require the federal government to fill those chairs. It's not necessarily open to the federal government to fail to fill those chairs over a long period of time. And it would be a good way to put pressure on the federal government to have people appointed with some kind of participation of us and other interest groups, so that we have more robust federal inputs. So those are my 2 points.
Thanks, Corinne.
Just on the first point, I did mention this before. The city staff are actually doing a report on the JP Morgan angle, which will include a report on the whether lobbying municipal laws have been complied with. There's some issue as to whether the ultimate investors have been disclosed and should have been or not. So we'll know a little bit more about that as of, I think it's July 16th or thereabouts, when that report comes out. Might be interesting. Mandamus, I've brought a bunch in my life, a lot of work. I can tell you I'm not volunteering for that. Somebody else may. I think if we get a mandamus order that they appoint 5 people to the vacancies, that they will probably appoint 5 very, very pro-Jets people to the board. It would probably be what they would do in response, I would think, but maybe I'm wrong. Others might want to get involved. We're dealing probably with a volunteer pro bono effort by somebody, but it's not going to be me.
Beth, you had a question, comment?
Well, yes, I was just curious if anyone has more experience with the Toronto Port Authority has any sense of whether those board positions are being intentionally left open because perhaps in their wisdom, the Liberal government is thinking about actually reconsidering the role of the Port Authority entirely, which would be so welcome. Because the Port Authority only, as you know, it's the only port in Canada that has basically no port to run. And it's only 15% of its revenues, and it's really the source of so much of this grief for us. And airports are run by, a single structure everywhere else in the country. So it's just so out of place. And I'm just wondering if anyone has any insights there or any ideas or has pursued any actions or research on that, because it does seem a tremendous problem for us.
So it's a really interesting question. Do I know why they haven't filled the 5 vacancies? No. Whether it's related to the issues you just raised, we don't know. What is interesting, I think, is that there are these governance issues about Toronto Port Authority, and you've actually outlined them very well. And I think that this whole thing, when it sort of subsides, will raise issues as to whether, in fact, the Toronto Port Authority, as constituted, is appropriate. Should there be a change in some way? It's a topic perhaps for another day. It's a complicated question. I don't know, Paul, maybe you have a view on that. I mean, you've been dealing with Toronto Port Authority probably for, many, many decades. I think they're problematic in other ways, which we haven't even got into here probably, but what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. I guess the only observation I'd make is I attended the annual general meeting of the Port Authority along with some others. And one of the questions that we asked was about the 5 vacancies. I believe there are 4 members currently serving on the Port Authority. So there's 9 in total. And the question we asked was, well, wait a minute, the 4 members constitute quorum? Are you legally in business? I mean, can you conduct business with 4 members? And apparently the answer was yes, according to the legislation and their rules, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then we got to what about the 5 vacancies? And, the answer by and large was, well, that's up to the federal government. We don't know. So we didn't get an answer. And I would like to think that maybe after this whole issue perhaps is dealt with successfully, that maybe the feds rethink the Port Authority because, as Beth said, I mean, there's the airport, there's the marina, and there's the actual port, with cruise ships and cargo vessels coming in, which is a very small component of their total revenue. The airport is the big one, and the marina generates revenue, but it's not, huge. So all these are great questions, and I think the reality is if you compare this port with Halifax or Vancouver or even Victoria, the answer is pretty obvious in terms of the comparison. It's the business of this port authority is really focused on the airport.
Just to
I
put it
can't
in
find the
context.
hand
Oh, there.
function.
Sorry, Beth. You mind if I go to Barry and then I can loop back to you, Beth? Don't
No.
go anywhere. Sorry, Barry.
Okay.
Yes, I don't necessarily see you, but now I see you, Barry. How are
Okay,
you?
thank you. I'm fine. A couple things about the Port Authority. I've been around a long time too. And the Port Authority there was not supposed to be a Port Authority set up in Toronto. And I can't remember if it was June Rowlands or the other woman mayor, who's
Barbara Hall.
Barbara Hall. They were told, or one of them was told, that Toronto would not be included in the list of port authorities. And when this legislation went to 3rd reading in Parliament, it was a Friday afternoon, and Dennis Mills and Tony Ianno moved an amendment to the legislation to create the Toronto Port Authority.
Oh my God.
And the city was not informed. This was done totally behind the backs of the city council and mayor. And the thing about it doesn't matter if they fill those positions or they don't. One thing that was very clear at that meeting week and a half ago was that the only duty that the members of the board have is a fiduciary duty to the functioning of the Port Authority. They don't have any concern about environmental effects, health effects, transit effects. None of that counts as long as the Port Authority is making money. That's their role. And if you think that if the government filled up those positions, it would change, it would not, because that their role isn't to listen to the people. They don't even have to listen to the government that appoints them. That's a very chilling thought in some ways. Anyway.
Thanks, Barry.
One of the bizarre effects of the, sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
One of the bizarre effects of the structure of the Port Authority is that they get to keep the money from land sales.
Yeah.
Water lot sales. So, for example, they sold their headquarters, the old Harbor Commissioners building, that lot for $96 million back in 2017. They sold a water lot last year, I think, to Waterfront Toronto for $20 million. The city had a similar sized water lot. It sold for $1 or something to Waterfront Toronto just to contribute to waterfront revitalization. So, and the remarkable thing is that they get to keep the proceeds. So, for example, the $96 million sale, the money goes into their own bank account. It doesn't go to the federal treasury. It doesn't go towards waterfront revitalization in some way. And you would have think that somebody in Ottawa would say, well, wait a second, if there's money to be made here out of selling legacy lands, especially ones they got for free, that, we, the federal, treasury should be getting the benefit of that money. But that's not the way it works. And I'm not sure if people are generally aware of that, but that is the case. So here, we're looking at a body which has a duty to support itself, meaning make money, support the, jobs for all the people who work there and so on, but no statutory duty to the public interest or to waterfront revitalization of any of the things that you would think would be relevant to this kind of issue. And that seems to me to be a governance model that is not right.
Toxic, perhaps. Toxic, perhaps, Ed.
Really?
Ron?
Yes, hi. I just wanted to come back briefly to the quorum issue. The governance manual for the Port Authority says the quorum necessary for the transaction of business at a meeting of the board at any time shall be a majority of the number of directors of which the Port Authority has actual knowledge have been appointed to the board at such time. A quorum of directors may exercise all powers of the board. So if they've only got 4, a majority of 4 is 2, I guess. That's, yeah. And as far, just to revisit Mark Wilson's point about the argument that, Q400s are out of production, it's a ridiculous argument. Obviously, ATR is making turboprops. It's like saying, Volkswagen discontinued the Beetle, so now we need to widen the 401 so everyone can have Escalades. It just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, that's it.
Right. Thank you. Beth, did you have a quick follow-up?
No, not at all. There's, as you said, it's a bigger issue. I was just curious what the thinking was.
It could be argued that waterfront planning, waterfront operations, if they weren't directly to be run from 100 Queen Street West, that they might actually be in that, something like Waterfront Toronto might in fact oversee that as with a public interest mandate. But that's just crazy talk, right?
I think there's lots, it's a rich vein.
It's crazy talk. But Ed is absolutely right. You were very polite, Ed, in how you described it, but I would say it's a toxic governance model.
It's completely. I mean, I really love the fact that I think Vancouver, I was looking at some stats yesterday, and they move 300 million tons. Toronto moves 6. And it's sugar, salt, cement, and aggregate. All argued that they can only exist, these ports must exist because they're heavy and can't go through the train model because they need to serve the local market of Toronto. So again, it's a municipal jurisdiction issue. There's a lot, I think. And I'm just curious. I think it's not impossible. They're looking at this as something to rethink, and we should do everything we can.
Thank you, Beth. Absolutely. Okay, it's coming up 9 o'clock. I don't want to keep everyone, I know that I feel, we got one more. I've got time for one more. Sonia?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Sonia.
Hi. Sorry. So I actually live across from the airport. There it is. Can you see
Hi.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So 219 Fort York, I'm a citizen, but that's not what I'm talking about today. It's Happy Pride. Someone wrote in the group that we should also continue the outreach, in particular to a younger and more diverse audience. So it is Pride weekend, and I don't know how many of you have seen the plaque on at Hanlon's Point that describes the history of the Hanlon's Point. It's like, so in 2023, the city of Toronto recognized it as the oldest surviving queer space in Canada. So Hanlon's Point remains historically an important space for this community, and there's Pride this weekend, right? So I think you guys should have a booth there. I really do. Or even go to the beach and like get signatures. Like that would be like a massive like population that would want to support. And like on the plaque I was just reading, it's like in August of 1971, 250 people participated in a picnic at Hanlon's Point, a call to protest and a celebration of gay pride. And it was the first public event of its kind in Canada. So it was the first protest gathering for the LGBTQ community, or the 2S plus LGBTQ community. So this 1971 picnic led to Toronto's first Pride Week in 1972, which included a protest march to Queen's Park on University Avenue, and the picnics on Toronto Island repeated many times, growing in size and laying the foundation for future Pride protests and celebrations. So that is this coming weekend at Church and Wellesley. And Hanlon's Point, like it is like the most progressive space I think maybe in the world. I'm not even kidding. And so from the human rights angle, like this marginalized group doesn't need any more hate and jets, and that kind of culture would just ruin that element completely, let alone the wildlife and other historic things. Like the Gibraltar Lighthouse is the oldest building. This is also from the plaque on the lighthouse that I read. It's the oldest building in Toronto because before anything was built, they needed something not to hit shores and stuff. I have a lot of different comments that I'll be writing in like to my MPs about, but just in the idea of like getting actually a community is coming to you in a way. So if like any type, even like doing some activism and political activism in that regard would be just an opportunity to do outreach for a younger
Sonia, I'm really glad to hear from you, Sonia. Thank you. I will actually confess that I have been an occasional visitor to Hanlon's Point Beach, and I've enjoyed it very much, and it's very welcoming, regardless of who you are, which I very much appreciate. It would strike me, now I may be wrong, Sonia, but it would strike me that though I think there may be one or two people I've spoken to, no names, who seem to have a slightly more nuanced take, but it would strike me that, jets flying in every 3 minutes would kind of harsh the vibe.
Absolutely. My brother got married at Liberty Grand last summer on August 31st, and the snowbirds ruined his wedding. I have that's from like a personal experience. So yeah, it's not like we're all on the same team here and we're going to win. Like there's no way this can go past. And I think what really it is about, the root of this is about governments. It's about improving the governance in the land. So in terms of the uncertainty of process, I think that's kind of really what's going to happen. The political change that'll come out of this will be really important because the waterfront is for everyone. And I run on that waterfront all the time. Like there's 38 stories. I'm on the 31st floor. There's over 1,500 people in the building. If they put jets there, I'm not going to be here for much longer. I could go on about that, but yeah, I think the human rights angle actually in lieu of Pride weekend, like there's definitely an opportunity for some collaborative activism. And I thank you for all this information. The Ports Authority was problematic to begin with. So.
Well, thank you so much, Sonia. Really thank you. It was
that's
a wonderful way to put an exclamation mark.
Happy Pride, yeah.
Happy Pride. Well, I can't think of a better exclamation point. Thanks to Sonia for that. It was very important and very helpful. And indeed, we do have too many old faces in these meetings sometimes. And I'm going to challenge all of you. If you have, adult children, friends, if you have, as I do, I'm privileged to have, some millennial friends that I socialize with, encourage them to get involved and attend, or, show up, or, come to the website, go to Reality Check TO, write, take 2 seconds to send a note to someone, etc. That would be great. We will be back again. I sent, by the way,
I'm going to jump in with one thing.
please.
Don't forget our donate button right up there prominently on the edge of the water, the WFA website. If you could find a buck or two here or there.
And it's in the chat. Again, I put it in the chat. Ed, great minds think alike. I was going to say exactly the same. Thank you, Ed, for that. And guess what? It only costs $20 a year to join and be a member, and only $140 as a lifetime membership. I have a feeling so many people have bought into that it may be too inexpensive. We may be revisiting those price points at next year's AGM. So get in while it's inexpensive. Thanks, Ken, very, very much. Thank you, Paul, for showing up and being here with us. Thank you, Ron and Ed, for your great presentations. Thanks to everyone who asked a question, and we bid you all a good night. Bonne nuit. Be safe, and let's keep on fighting for a good waterfront for all. Bye bye.